Hello and welcome to a new episode of A Flatpack History of Sweden, the podcast that takes you on a chronological journey throughout Swedish history, and we've now reached the middle of the 1200s. I am Chris.
And I'm Elsa, and today we're picking up where we left off last week and then actually going back a bit to give you the backstory to one of the most iconic characters in Swedish history, Birger Magnusson, or as he'll be known in the history books, Birger Jarl.
Yes, Birger Jarl and the political events during his life is what will take up most of our time for this and probably the next episode as well, because he's a very interesting person with a very full life. And if you think it's a bit noisy or perhaps windy right now, well, that's because we're standing on his square, or at least the square that carries his name.
Yes, we're on Birger Jarl's Torg, or Birger Jarl's Square, on the Riddarholmen Island in central Stockholm. We're surrounded by lots of beautiful 17th and 18th century buildings, including the old Parliament building and the Wrangelska Palace, and a building that's almost contemporary to where we are in the podcast chronology, the Riddarholmen Church from roughly the year 1300.
Yes, that's only half a century or so on from the events of today's episode. Now, Birger Jarl's Square has not been called that for quite as long as it's been around. It got the name in 1854. That was also the year when a statue of the man himself, which is right in front of us now, and made by sculptor Bengt Erland Fulgoberg, was put up on the square. So let's have a look at the statue now. It's probably 10 meters tall. The plinth is 10 meters tall, and then the statue is just sort of slightly larger than life size. And he's green now. He's very green with a lot of black over him because he's made out of copper probably, and he's now sort of not stood the test of time.
Yeah, but he does look very forceful. He's wearing like a cape, and he's got a helmet on, and he's sort of got his arms resting on a sword, and then he's got his shield in front of him as well, and very stern looking face.
And he's wearing some armor on his shins as well. So yeah, he looks like a very ruler type kind of guy. And on the column of the statue it says, "Of Birger Jarl," and then it has the somewhat dubious claim of Stockholm's founder. Which we talked about in the episode on the beginnings of Stockholm, but it didn't really just appear out of nowhere, Stockholm. But some people like to give Birger Jarl the credit.
Yeah, and not a lot of people from as early in history as the 1200s get things like squares named after them. So it goes to show what an important figure Birger Jarl was in early Swedish history. Still is. In fact, he doesn't just have this square named after him. There is also a street, Birger Jarlsgatan, here in Stockholm, about 2.5 kilometers north of where we're standing now. It's one of the biggest and most important roads in the city centre.
Yeah, and just behind one of the buildings here, there's even Birger Jarl's tower. And in general, this square is an indication of both what a powerful figure Birger Jarl was in his own time, and how he has been remembered throughout history as really Sweden's first major statesman in Swedish politics, someone who actually was a politician rather than just a fighty king who took power and then kept on killing other people. Like we said, we're going to be dedicating the next few episodes to his life and work. But as always, we should probably start with the Swedish phrase of the week. But I think for that, we should probably head home where it's quieter, less busy, less windy, less cars, and less electric scooters driving around the cobblestones. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, I don't see why electric scooters have really taken off in Stockholm, but they have, because a lot of streets are cobblestone.
But yeah, right. So see you back in the flat. And now we're back in the flat. Hopefully that wasn't too noisy and windy for you. We did realise it was a bit windy once we started recording, but we had no other option.
Yeah, but that was fun. I really liked that little trip to Old Town in Stockholm and see the statue of Birger Jarl.
Yep, but as we promised, it's time for a Swedish phrase. And so this week's phrase is "Som man bäddar får man ligga." So in English, that would be how you make the bed, that's how you have to lie in it. And if you're like me, you don't make the bed.
Yeah, so you have to lie in an unmade bed. It sounds a bit strange in English, I must say. It's probably one of the stranger phrases that we've done, but the meaning is very similar to the English phrase, you reap what you sow. It means that however you prepare, that is the result you'll get.
So if someone comes back and says, oh, I didn't do very well on that test at school, but they haven't really studied for it at all, then you could say, som man bäddar får man ligga.
Exactly. Well, you get the results depending on how you prepare for it. There is also a slightly dirtier version of this phrase.
Okay.
Well, ligga is Swedish for to lie down, but it's also a slang word for having sex, as in to lie with someone. Or in English, we'd say to sleep with someone, even if it's implied that you do more than just sleep. So you then take the phrase som man bäddar får man ligga and instead say som man raggar får man ligga. Ragga being the Swedish word for flirt or to chat someone up. So it then becomes how you do your flirting is how you get to have sex.
Which is kind of the same as the original phrase, I guess. But probably time to get on with Birger Jarl as someone who did a lot of preparing.
Yeah, someone who was very good at making his bed well, so that he got to lie in it comfortably, was our main man, Birger Jarl. As we'll see when we go through his life, he was definitely a man with a plan. A man who knew how and when to play his cards right in order to get what he wanted.
And we introduced Birger Jarl briefly at the end of our last episode, when in the 1230s Birger Jarl married King Erik's sister Ingeborg back when he was just Birger Magnusson, and then he became one of the king's closest men and headed campaigns to Finland and Novgorod before fighting off a rebellion by the Folkung faction in 1247. But it's worth going over these events again, but to see them more from Birger Jarl's perspective so we can see who Birger Jarl was and what he did and how he did it. Because, like Åsa said, he really is one of the most important people in Swedish medieval history.
First of all, before we go any further, let's just once and for all clear up some name confusion. We call him Birger Jarl, but that's not his name. Well, his first name is Birger, but his surname isn't Jarl. His surname is Magnusson, like Chris said, and he's a member of the powerful Bjelbo family. So Jarl isn't a name, it's a job title.
And for some reason with Birger Jarl, it comes after his name rather than before, like most of the others.
Yeah, we've heard the term Jarl many times already in our episodes, pretty much since we entered the Middle Ages. The word actually has the same origin as the English word earl. It's sort of a counselor, advisor, manager in the Middle Ages in Scandinavia and in England. The Jarls are the king's right-hand men, and they help implement the power of the king. Not in Sweden, but over in England, the earldom was connected to a certain area. You were Jarl or Earl over an area like Wessex. Previously, we've seen Jarls in Sweden like the powerful Birger Brosa or Ulf Fase, who we talked about in our last episode. But confusingly, when we talk about these people, their names are usually written as Jarl Ulf Fase rather than Ulf Fase Jarl. But for some reason, like Chris said, Birger Jarl gets the word Jarl put after his first name.
And this makes it a bit confusing sometimes because Birger Jarl isn't Jarl for most of the early part of his career and for pretty much a lot of what we're going to talk about in this episode. But even though his name throughout most of this episode is Birger Magnusson and that remained his name throughout his life, we're just going to call him Birger Jarl because that's the name he goes down in history and that's the name you should search for or Google or read about if you want to know more about him.
Yeah, so let's start at the beginning. Birger Jarl was born in... we don't know.
Yep. Like so many of the births we've had so far, including many of the kings, medieval Swedes were less bothered with recording dates of births than we are today. Instead, they focused on the date that someone died, because there was usually someone around to record it, whereas when these people were born, you didn't necessarily know if this was going to be an important person or not, so they didn't bother writing it down.
Yeah, and let's face it, most people don't do much interesting stuff when they're born, but by the time they've died, they might have done some interesting things that made their death date more noteworthy than their birth date.
Exactly. Because of this means that historians have had to try and backtrack and look at the events in Birger Jarl's life that were recorded, and then sort of guess, okay, well, he was probably at least 16 or 17 when he started fighting and things like that. And then in the more modern day, historians and archaeologists have been able to do cool things like make analysis of his bones 20 years ago or so when they opened up his grave. And this kind of thing has led them to conclude that he was born sometime between 1190 and 1210. So to make it a nice round number, we can say right in the middle, 1200.
He grew up in the county of Östergötland, so that's south central Sweden, on his family's estate called Bjällbo, like they were called. Birger is born into the powerful Bjällbo family, who we've seen play an important role on the political stage for almost a century now. Birger's uncle is the powerful Jarl Birger Brosa, who he's probably named after, because Birger Brosa is quite likely dead by the time Birger is born, so Birger Jarl gets his deceased uncle's name. Birger's other uncle is another Jarl called the Death, who died in battle over in Estonia, which we talked about in episode 34. Karl the Death's son, Ulf Fase, is Jarl right now in our timeline, so he's Birger's cousin. Birger's mum and dad are called Ingrid Ylva and Magnus Minnesköld. His father isn't really present in his life. He's either dead when Birger is born or dies soon after. His mother, on the other hand, this woman called Ingrid Ylva, is described as a resourceful and strong woman who gives her children the best upbringing possible to guarantee that they will become powerful and influential as well.
Birger Jarl is pretty much born straight into power. The Bjällbo family has worked hard to cement their power, being kingmakers and pragmatic behind-the-scenes rulers for quite some time now. And in many ways, Birger is pretty much destined for a life of power and to be involved in politics. Birger is the youngest of his father's children. It's worth having a quick look at who Birger's siblings are, again, just to help us paint a picture of what this family was like and what they were doing. Birger has 3 older brothers. Eskil is a man who becomes a lawman in Västergötland, and this is the Eskil that we talked about in our Law and Order episodes, who helps write the Västergöta Law, Sweden's first ever written down legal text that we've mentioned quite a few times so far. Then there's Karl and Bengt, who seem to have a bit of a monopoly over being bishops of Linköping and being powerful figures in the church. Karl went with King Johan on that disastrous campaign to Estonia and died there with his uncle Karl in 1220. Bengt, on the other hand, lives a lot longer and succeeds his brother as bishop, and is the one in charge of the rebuilding of Linköping Cathedral in 1237. And he's the person we called Bishop Bjällbo in the last episode, just because there were other bishops also called Bengt. Birger also has an unknown number of sisters who we don't really know anything about because, well, they're women, and history has an unfortunate habit of being written by men and focusing on the men in the story.
It's quite likely, considering the age difference, that not all of the brothers had the same mother. And it's also likely that he had another half-brother, meaning that his mother had a new man after Magnus Minnesköld's death and got another son, so a half-brother of Birger's called Elof. We don't know much about Elof. He seems to have led a different kind of life from the others, which is why historians think he wasn't actually part of this powerful Bjelbo family as such, but rather someone who was on their mother's side.
So this is the family that Birger Jarl is born into, and unfortunately we don't know much about his early life. He doesn't really appear in any of the records until the late 1220s and early 1230s. We can just assume he grew up, played with other kids and members of the family, learned to read and write, ride horses and fight with swords.
When he starts to appear in the sources, he's described as one of the men around King Erik. After all, his cousin is the Jarl, he himself is a young man from a powerful family, and he's been brought up to be a part of that life. So it's perhaps natural that he would end up sort of floating around the king. One thing that will change Birger Jarl from being just one of the men around the king to being the man around the king is the fact that he marries the king's sister, Ingeborg. We don't know exactly when this happens, but it will have been in the early 1230s. Marriage, as we know at this time, and especially for this group in society, is much more a political game and a power play than it is a union of two people who are in love. That being said, Birger and Ingeborg seem to have gotten on okay, and who knows, perhaps they even grew to love each other.
And with his marriage to Ingeborg, Birger's status increases even more. Partly because of this, and partly because he seems to have a real talent for politics and war. Birger soon becomes the king's representative for going around the country and solving various local disputes. And remember, this is a time when you have to be physically present to show your power. In order for the king to show that he ruled the land, he had to be present in places, or at least send someone to represent him. The system of a nation-state still wasn't really that ingrained in society, and it therefore required a different kind of presence as it does today. And the Swedish Prime Minister today doesn't have to go up to Luleå in the far north himself if there's a problem there, or send someone to represent himself personally, because he can trust that the people living there will solve it in accordance to the legal system and within the system of the state that's around them, because it's so ingrained in our society. His medieval counterparts, however, the kings and the jarls, couldn't quite trust this system because it was still relatively weak.
Yeah, that's why the royal court was mobile. It went round places rather than always sat in the same palace. And that's why you need people like Birger Jarl who went round and represented the institution of the state, the king and its power.
The most famous of these local disputes that Birger Jarl was sent to resolve happened down in Småland in 1238. At the time, and well, up to 1658, Småland was the most southerly county in Sweden, because remember, Skåne and Blekinge, the southern tip of the Scandinavian peninsula, belonged to Denmark at this time. The dispute that Birger Jarl sent to fix involved local farmers and the monks at Nydala Abbey. Basically, the monks and the farmers couldn't agree on who should have some access and control over some forest nearby. The farmers said that the forest had always been theirs, whereas the monks said that they needed the forest for their beekeeping and various other things to do with the abbey. Birger Jarl's solution to the problem itself isn't really that amazing. Essentially, the farmers and the monks just got half of the land each that they've been fighting over, so it's not exactly a show of amazing negotiation skills, but rather it's the fact that Birger manages to resolve the situation with both parties being kind of pleased, the church has been kept on side and the power of the crown upheld, which shows you that he's succeeded in his task. It's also important as this is the first example we have of Birger Jarl using this authority to take decisions.
And that really is the skill that will make Birger Jarl the political figure that he becomes. He makes sure that the church was kept on side, that the power of the king, and by extension the jarldom, was always upheld or strengthened, And he got results that all sides could live with, or at least had to live with. Those are the sort of three legs of his political life. He manages to do things that succeed in all those three variables. Next, in Birger Jarl's work calendar, we imagine he had one of those calendars online.
It pings up with a little bell 15 minutes before your appointment.
Yeah, exactly. He clicked dismiss and went off on to a campaign in Finland and eventually all the way to Novgorod, where the Swedes were defeated by Prince Alexander at the Battle of Neva on the 15th of July, 1240.
Now, we covered this campaign in the East quite extensively in our last episode, including a long quote from the Novgorod Chronicle, so if you haven't listened to that, I recommend you do. But one thing we didn't mention in that episode is that some people believe that Birger Jarl sustained a wound to his face in the battle when he was slashed by a sword, and so for the rest of his life he has a big scar on his face, calling him Scarface. If this is true, it indicates that Birger Jarl either led from the front and wasn't a commander who hung back and got involved in the fighting directly, or the Novgorodians were a bit sneaky and managed to ambush him or something. But either way, he was definitely involved in the fight, if this was actually the case.
Even though the Swedes were ultimately defeated at Neva and never managed to really crack the power of Novgorod, the campaign itself did mean that Swedish influence, and in particular the power of the Swedish monarch, was further entrenched on the other side of the Baltic Sea in what is today Finland. If the Swedes ever wanted to go further east, they needed to first solidify their power and presence in Finland and not rush ahead to Novgorod like they did this time. They realized this after this campaign, and that meant that they now worked on building more fortresses in Finland from which the Swedes could exert their power, but also protect land that was now considered theirs as a result of Birger Jarl's campaign. And Christianity was further entrenched in the area, bringing that part of southern Finland more into a pan-European Catholic community. And we'll return to more on Finland in a special Finland-centered episode pretty soon.
And after that campaign in Finland in 1240, and pretty much all the way up to 1247, we don't really know much about what Birger Jarl got up to. There's no real events or military campaigns or anything like that we have recorded in the sources, but we do know that King Eric gets married in this period, and that his new wife Katarina is a relative of Birger's because she's his cousin's daughter. And whilst this is happening, Birger Jarl had something else to do with his time, because clearly was hanging out with his wife a bit, because they ended up having 8 children.
Well, that's nice. Nice to have some family time. Although he must have had time to squeeze in some family time even before 1240. I don't know, in between negotiations in Småland and campaigns in Finland, because his oldest child was born in 1238. Either way, Birger Jarl and Ingeborg will eventually have 4 sons and 4 daughters. Shall we quickly run through who they are?
Yes, and how about you start with the daughters, because their first child is a daughter.
Yes, that's Rikissa, born around 1238 and named after her maternal grandmother. Rikissa is a classic Eric dynasty name by this point, by the way. We've had a lot of Rikissas. Unfortunately, like with their dad, we don't know the exact birth dates for any of Birger Jarl's kids, so let's just ignore that and say that they are all born between the late 1230s and the early 1250s. Rikissa, the firstborn, will become important in the story again later, so keep her name in mind. Then there's Kristina, who marries a wealthy Swedish nobleman. She is followed by Katarina and Ingeborg, who both marry German princes. So that's very good there for Swedish-German relations. Get in there with the Germans. That seems to have been the policy of the time. That's what you want to do because they're wealthy and they trade a lot of stuff.
Yes, they certainly do. And as for Birger's sons, the oldest one is Valdemar, followed by Magnus. Without spoiling too much again, make sure you remember these names because they'll come back in the next episode. Their third son, Eric, died when he was in his mid-20s, and because of that, he didn't really have much time to do anything to the great extent as his brothers did. And they also have a fourth son called Bengt, who follows in his uncle's and namesake's footsteps and becomes Bishop of Linköping because it's monopolized by this small branch of the family. And it also helps if you're named Bengt. And not just that, but he'll also get a political role later on, but more on that to come. Even with 8 children with his wife, Birger still had time to have a long-term mistress, whose name, unfortunately, we don't know. But we do know that he had a son together called Gregors, which sounds very a modern-day name, Gregors.
Gregors?
Yeah. And he became a minor nobleman, apparently, when he grew up.
Yeah, he's a busy man, Birger, both on the home front with 9 children, a wife and a mistress, but also at work, because on the political scene in 1247, the Folkungs rise up and riot again. Eventually, this results in the Battle of Sparsätra that year. Again, we talked about who the Folkungs were and why they were rebelling in our previous episode, so we'll just cover it briefly here. Birger Jarl led the royal forces on behalf of King Erik, and for the first time in Swedish history, he used heavy cavalry. Opposing Birger is Holmgar Knutsson, son of the previous king Knut the Tall. Holmgar thinks he should be king because his dad was king, and he also thinks that the Bjelbo family should back off a bit and that the state shouldn't be so centralized or levy such heavy taxes.
And in a way, Holmgar and the Folkungs represented a desire to return to an older, more local form of power and statehood in Sweden. Unfortunately for them, they're defeated in this battle, and Holmgar tries to flee, but is eventually captured and decapitated, and his friend Philip Larsson, another important Folkung representative, is forced away into exile. But whilst they're defeated on the battlefield for now, it's definitely not the end of the Folkungs or this general desire for some people in Sweden to rebel against the system of the state that's becoming stronger and stronger, with the power of the king becoming more extensive and spreading thanks to the Jarls. So keep this in mind as well. This is bubbling on in the background.
It's also around this time that Ulf Fase, who has been Jarl for all of Birger's adult life, he dies. We don't know exactly when he died, and historians have debated whether he died before the Battle of Sparsätra, or after, or even during. Historians are also not sure if Ulf Fase was Jarl all the way up until his death, or if he retired, even though that concept probably didn't exist, but retired sometime before. Even if he did officially leave the Jarldom, assuming he wasn't sick or incapacitated, he would still have been the elder statesman of both the Bjelbo family and Sweden as a whole.
Yeah, so he probably had some sort of influence if he was still around. But either way, we don't know exactly when it happens, but we do know that when Ulf Fase is dead or leaves the Jarldom, King Erik needs a new Jarl, so he turns to Birger. Or, as the most prominent member of the Bjelbo family, Birger Jarl demanded the position when it became vacant. In fact, it's been speculated that maybe Ulf Fase was annoyed with Birger's increasing power both in the family and in Sweden, and swapped sides and joined the Folkungs, and therefore either died in the battle or was killed soon after as a punishment. But this is all a bit of a speculation, and there's no historical evidence to suggest this. But because there is a lot of confusion around what happened to Ulf Fase at the end of his life, this theory has persisted throughout history for some reason.
So, Birger Jarl is now actually Birger the Jarl. He seems to have been so powerful at this point that there was no real contest. Instead, it was just fairly obvious that he should become Jarl. First of all, because he's from the Bjelbo family, who, I mean, hello, Jarl is like their middle name. Adding to that, he's the king's brother-in-law, and he's been in charge of all these important missions, all the way from solving domestic disputes to going off to Finland and Novgorod, and now he's been putting down domestic revolts. So, yeah, he's just the man.
Yes, and here he is. He's now got the job, probably in his late 30s and more like early 40s, and he's now the man in Sweden. He was a powerful person before, but from the day he becomes Jarl to the day he dies, there's absolutely no question about where the ultimate power ruling Sweden lies, and that's with him, with Birger. He does remain loyal to King Eric and doesn't try to overthrow him in any way, but he does wield a lot of executive power, so to speak, on the king's behalf.
And he's off to a busy start. No sooner is the Battle of Spalsätra over, and it's time for an important church meeting at Skänninge. Now, church meetings, that might not sound very important to you, but this is not an hour of cake and cucumber sandwiches in the church hall to talk about this year's nativity play. No. This is a meeting that will solidify elements of the Swedish judicial system, as well as have a huge impact on the life of members of the clergy.
Yes, because the Skänninge-mötet, the meeting at Skänninge, takes place on the 1st of March 1248. And in reality, it probably lasts longer than a day, but that's just the day that's recorded. Skänninge is a village in Östergötland, so in fact it's quite close to the village of Bjelbo, where Birger grew up and where the family's ancestral home is. This meeting is extra important because there's also a papal presence at the meeting. The Pope has sent his representative, Wilhelm of Sabina, or even Wilhelm of Modena, as he's sometimes called, to be there. Now, to understand why a church meeting and the presence of a papal legate is so important, we must remember what a strong political force the papacy is, and the whole Catholic Church was at the time. The Church and the Pope, since he's the head of the Church, united Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and that was a unity that went beyond just the religious sections of society. It also helped inspire political unity and influenced law and policy making. Of course, as we saw last time around, the Chancellor of Sweden during Eric XI's Regency Council period was Bishop Bengt, a religious figure fulfilling a major political role in the country. In our Law and Order episodes, we talked about how influences from the Roman Catholic Church changed the Swedish legal system, and how some aspects of the legal system, what we might call today civil law, was not actually ruled over by the state, but by the church. And the church, both in the sense of the entire Catholic Church as a whole, and in the sense of individual churches and parishes, were also very wealthy. This is because they levied their own taxes, they had lots of land, and they collected gold and fancy stuff.
Birger Jarl knew that the best thing to do was to stay friends with the church, and to find a balance of power and use the network of contacts that this pan-European church gave you access to, and use that for your advantage. That's why the meeting at Skänninge was so important. We will talk more later about Birger Jarl as a lawmaker and how he was very keen on instituting national laws that protected people and places, and laws that were the same everywhere in Sweden. But for now, it's probably enough to say that at Skänninge-mötet, Birger Jarl formalizes Roman law as the basis for the Swedish legal system. But the Skänninge-mötet is first and foremost a meeting about church matters. The papacy, through their representative Wilhelm of Sabina, wants to strengthen the power of the different bishoprics in Sweden. After all, these bishoprics are the extended arm of the papacy in the country, so that's why they think it's important that they are powerful and work well. And most historians argue that the papacy succeeded in this.
Perhaps the most tangible thing that came out of the meeting was the de facto implementation of celibacy in the church in Sweden. Celibacy had long been a key part of ecclesiastical life in the Catholic Church in Europe. Bishops, priests, and monks, anyone really who was ordained and worked for the church, should live in celibacy. But Sweden had been very bad at actually implementing this. Even though by this point the Catholic Church has a very strong presence in the country and has done for a few hundred years by now. After all, Sweden's so far from the centre of power in Rome, and, well, we can only assume that the priests thought it was nice to share their lives with someone, have a wife and kids, and if they could get away with it, they would.
Now it is time to put an end to this. Wilhelm of Sabina has a message from the Pope to all the priests and bishops in Sweden, and that message is basically, enough is enough, no more sleeping with women, no more having wives, and that's final. The Swedes didn't seem too happy with this, especially not the priests themselves, but it seems to have been one of those things that they were just forced to accept in order to remain on good terms with the papacy. We can only imagine Birger Jarl telling all the priests that, yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I know this sucks, but come on, you need to stop sleeping around and leave your wives so that I can make sure that the Pope keeps liking us. I mean, come on guys, do it for the sake of politics. In the end, these bishops accepted the ruling from Rome and Wilhelm of Sabina got his way. Birger Jarl was also then able to market himself as someone who the church can deal with and get things done.
After this meeting, Birger Jarl might have even gone over to Finland again. We're not entirely sure about that, and neither are the historians. Remember, there was, or perhaps still is to this day, a mix-up with the dates, where some sources say that the events of the Finland and Novgorod campaign in 1238-1239 actually took place in 1248-1249. And there is evidence that suggests Birger Jarl might have even been in Finland, or at least away from the royal centre of power at this point, due to what happens next. So maybe had gone to Finland again, we don't really know. All throughout the 1240s, Birger has been involved in the events on the other side of Scandinavia, though, namely in Norway. Norway has been going through very turbulent times for probably half a dozen of our episodes and almost a century now, and this has spilled over time and time again and has affected Swedish-Norwegian relations as well. Back in 1241, Birger Jarl acted as King Eric's representative in negotiations with the Norwegian King Håkon. Ulf Vasa, who was Jarl back then, was keen to maintain peace with Norway, even though Norwegian troops had attacked Sweden. However, in 1241, negotiations didn't lead to a lasting peace. So there was bubbling tensions after 1241 for quite a while. But now, when we get to 1249, Birger has his Jarl hat on, and he succeeds in securing a peaceful resolution to the hostilities with Norway at the Treaty of Lödöse. Lödöse is a village in Västergötland, and at this point it's pretty much Sweden's most western point. And interestingly enough, it's not actually on the coast, because Sweden has no western coast yet. What is today the west coast of Sweden, at this point, is Norwegian or Danish territory. Norway comes all the way down to the point where it meets Denmark, and there's no Swedish west coast on the side of the country. Lödöse sits on the shores of the Göta River, but from here you can actually access the sea to the west, because the river goes all the way out to the sea, and that makes Lödöse Sweden's main point for trading out west at this time. In order to secure this treaty with Norway, Birger plays the old, let's marry some of our kids with one another so that we can become family and therefore less likely to fight each other card. It needs to be quite a big card to fit all that on.
But it was a popular card.
It was a popular card.
They played that card a lot in medieval times.
Yes, absolutely. And in this instance, Birger throws his own family into the game and marries off his daughter Rikissa to Håkon Håkonsson the Young, who was the Norwegian king's son and heir. Rikissa was actually only 11 at the time when her dad uses her as this bargaining chip in foreign politics, so we're not entirely sure how happy she was about this, but it was probably coming at some point or another, so just get on with it was probably what her dad said, unfortunately. So yeah, that's what's going on at the moment. Birger is busy with foreign politics, both in the east and in the west. And this is where we got to in the last episode. So we've all caught up just in time for King Eric to die on the 2nd of February, 1250, just a few years after Birger officially becomes Jarl.
Oh, sad times. King Eric is only 34 years old when he dies, so that's quite young, even for the time. We don't know what he dies from, but we know he doesn't die in a battle or anything like that. He dies from natural causes. We just don't know what those causes were. King Eric will go down in history with a somewhat unfortunate, or actually really quite mean nickname. He will be known as Erik den Lispe och Halte, which in English would be Eric the Lisp and the Lame. It is a rather mean and rather ableist name because it most likely derives from the fact that he might have had a speech impediment and an unknown condition or injury that made him walk differently. But we don't know what these impediments or injuries might have been. They're not mentioned in any sources of the time.
Instead, it's the Eric Chronicle, which was written almost 100 years after he died and was quite negative towards his reign in general, that describes him as this lisp and lame character. And this seems to have stuck as a name throughout history, unfortunately, even to the point where I know also when we were talking about the episode beforehand, you remembered that he was called this when you were learning about the Middle Ages in middle school. He was called this in the textbooks or something, you said.
Yeah, in our textbook it said King Erik den Lesbo och Halte. Like that was the official name that he went by. But like we said, it's a mean nickname that aims at mocking a potential disability, and we think it should be left in history and not carried on. So that's why we've just called him King Eric or Eric the 11th in our podcast.
Yes, but unfortunately for him, he's dead now at this point, and he leaves no heirs. His marriage to Katarina has resulted in no children, so there's no natural heir in the family. Not only that, but Eric was the last surviving male member of the Eric dynasty. In the previous episode, the Sverker dynasty had died out on the male line, so this is it, really.
Yeah, you're right. We're kind of at the end of a historical chapter. Unintentionally, probably. There's no evidence to suggest that the two families meant to die out, but they did. And here we are. What's to come, or rather, who's to come on the throne of Sweden?
Yes, and that's the question that everybody in politics in Sweden at the time would have been asking themselves. Or perhaps there wasn't, because there's one man who's risen to power over the course of the last 2 decades, and he will want to be a part of this. But not just want to be a part of it, he is a part of it, because he's the Jarl of the kingdom, and of course it's Birger Jarl, and he's absolutely involved.
Now, we're not quite sure because, again, there's that mix-up of dates, but the Eric Chronicle says that Birger was in Finland when King Eric died. Wherever he was, he hurries back to Sweden because there's now a battle for the throne to sort out. Or, well, there's no military battle, but there is a political one. Again, we don't know the details, but looking at it in hindsight, there seems to have been 3 possible contenders for the throne.
The first is Philip, the other son of Knut the Tall. His brother Holger might be dead, but Philip is still around somewhere in Sweden. He's also a leading member of this Folkung faction that we've talked about, so he's probably quite keen to take the throne and move Sweden in a different direction. Then there's a man called Knut. Knut is the son of a powerful nobleman called Magnus Borka, and he's a great-grandson of famous Jarl Birger Brusa, so he's got a bit of that mighty Bjälbo family connection going for him. And then finally, there's Valdemar, Birger Jarl's own son. Now, remember, Birger is married to Ingeborg, the newly deceased king's sister. So Valdemar, their son, is the king's nephew, albeit from the female side of the family, and is the closest male relative around. This is really what Valdemar has got going for him in the battle for the throne. He's the closest male relative to the previous king, and he's the one with the strongest blood connection to the last reigning dynasty, the Erik dynasty, albeit on his mother's side, plus the fact that his dad is the Jarl, who has really been running the country for the last 5 years or so.
There are also children of King Erik's other sister, Sophia, who is married to the Lord of Rostock. That couple have 2 sons, but they're both around 10 years old and very much more German than Swedish, so they don't seem to have been in the picture at all. Instead, it's Birger Jarl's son, Valdemar, who seems to be a strong contender. Again, we don't know quite how it happened, but it's no stretch of the imagination to assume that Birger played the nepotism card here, and seeing as he was the Jarl and the person with probably the most political influence in the country, well, he made his own son king. This is one of the major moments in Swedish history and will have repercussions for many years to come.
Yes, as Valdemar is duly elected king and succeeds his maternal uncle on the Swedish throne in 1250. We can only guess what Valdemar thought of this himself because, just like his distant relatives, he's also only 10 at the time.
Birger Jarl has worked to put his 10-year-old son on the throne. This ensures that not only does he naturally stay on as Jarl, because if you're 10, you're not really going to fire your dad, he is also the dad of, a very young new king. Essentially, this is a power grab by Birger. There is no regency council this time. It's simply Birger Jarl making all the decision, putting a 10-year-old kid on the throne.
Yes, and everything you read about Birger Jarl in both contemporary sources and what later historians have said about him, it's quite clear that he never put himself forward as king. He knew he didn't have the, at least fake, family lineage to go back and claim this. He wasn't related to the royal family as directly as his son was. So he didn't want the crown, he wanted the power, and by making his son king, he kept that power that he's had for quite some time now.
Yeah, because whilst Valdemar is busy, building pillow forts and collecting worms and everything else that you do when you're 10, it's Birger who actually rules the kingdom. Valdemar takes a quick break from being a kid when he's crowned king in Linköping Cathedral in 1251. But then he goes back to being a kid. He doesn't really do anything. It's his dad who's in charge. And that will actually remain the case for much of Valdemar's life, really.
Indeed, and it's not going to be easy to be the one who grows up in the shadow of a father like Birger Jarl, but more on that in the next episode, because that's where we're going to leave it for today. Birger Jarl has had an interesting life so far, with his steady rise to power, marrying into power, but also using his skills in negotiating, his military skills campaigning in the east, and defeating local rebellions, before finally becoming Jarl, subduing more rebellions, and making his own son king. Even with that, though, it's only just getting started, and there's much more to come in the life of this man.
There certainly is, and it's like his life isn't just the life of one man, it's also the story of Swedish rule and Swedish politics for much of the latter half of the 1200s. So we will pick up here in 2 weeks' time, and until then, don't forget to follow us on social media and leave a review on whatever platform you're listening to us on. We've actually had 2 new lovely 5-star reviews that we are going to read out. Do you want to go first, Chris?
Yes, and this is from Dude of the Mountain, which is an excellent name. And it says, 5 stars, amazing show. As an American with a lot of Swedish ancestors, I wanted to know more about the history of Sweden. This podcast has been a great way to do that. I listen to an episode every morning on my way to work until I get caught up. I just finished episode 26 this morning. I really like the episodes that are recorded outdoors because the sounds from the environment make it into the show. So this is a perfect episode to read out this review because that's just what we've done. Detta fredag, mina bekanta. Insert IKEA frog meme here from Tura Lund. So thank you so very much. That's an excellent review. You possibly have caught up by now. I posted this late June and this will be mid-July. So hopefully you're listening to this not live, but, close to the release. And I hope you enjoyed the outside recording at the start of the episode.
Yeah, thank you for that review. And we've had another lovely 5-star review, this time from the Emerald Island, from the Republic of Ireland. This is from Anjou Ship. I hope I'm pronouncing your username okay there. Who writes, "A great listen. Loving this podcast, guys. Please keep it up. Love from Ireland."
So sending all the way to Ireland some Swedish love back.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that lovely review.
Thank you. Love Ireland. There's a strong Scandi connection there. There's some Viking heritage.
Yeah, not too many Swedish Vikings, but definitely a lot of Norwegians and some Danes.
There was a bunch of friends of mine went to, there's a Viking museum in Dublin, and they had a little Viking cuddly toy doll that you could buy, and my friend Taff bought it because the doll looked exactly like me.
Excellent. Did they give it to you or did they buy it for themselves?
No, they sent a picture of it to me, and then, I don't know what Taff did with it. I didn't get the doll.
No, that's disappointing.
But yeah, lovely connection there to Ireland. Great place.
Yeah, I didn't see when I last went to Ireland in 2015. Went to visit my friend in Galway, Marat, who occasionally listens to the podcast. Might not have caught up yet, but I didn't see any Viking things then, so I think I missed out, clearly.
But for wherever you're listening to us from, thank you so much. And keep leaving reviews. It means a lot, helps us get noticed.
Yes, and apparently we were 3rd on the history podcast list in Venezuela earlier in the month, so say hello to them also.
Vale, bueno, saludos a todos en Venezuela. Nos alegra mucho que ustedes les gustan el podcast.
But for now, it's goodbye from us in Stockholm.
Bye bye.
Hej då.